There are places in the world where hope goes to die, and Rowan Vale had chosen one of them deliberately. The northern mountain peaks where winter arrived in October and didn't leave until May, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight filtered through in scattered coins, where the silence was so complete it had weight and texture. Here, in a clearing barely large enough for a single structure, she had decided to build something impossible with materials that should never have held together. Broken branches scavenged from storm damage, bark peeled from fallen logs, strips of fabric torn from her dwindling supply of clothes to serve as makeshift rope. The cabin, if the skeletal framework of crooked timber could be called such, stood as testament to stubborn determination in the face of logic. Each morning brought new collapses, new failures, new proof that a human woman with bleeding hands and no proper tools had no business attempting construction in wilderness that had defeated seasoned survivalists. Each morning, Rowan rebuilt. She had been many things in her 26 years. Daughter of a man who'd preferred his whiskey to his family, employee of bosses who'd seen her gender before her competence, lover to someone who'd promised forever and delivered betrayal instead. But she had never been a quitter, even when quitting would have been the merciful choice. Exile from human lands had been the price of standing up to powerful men who didn't like being told no. Rejection by shifter packs had come from being too human for creatures who valued instinct over intellect. So she'd chosen the spaces between, the forgotten places where neither human nor wolf laid claim, where a woman could fail in private and die with dignity intact. The mountains didn't care about her past mistakes or future plans. They offered only the brutal honesty of survival. Work or perish. Adapt or freeze, build shelter, or sleep under stars that grew colder each night. Rowan had chosen to work. What she didn't know, as she wrestled another crooked beam into place and cursed the inadequate materials that kept shifting under her weight, was that her struggle had an audience. High above on cliff faces that seemed unclimbable, golden eyes tracked her movements with the patience of a predator and the intensity of something far more personal. The Lycan king had been watching for 7 days, drawn by reports of human activity in territory his kind had claimed, but rarely patrolled. What he'd expected to find was a lost hiker or foolish camper who could be quietly redirected to safer ground. What he'd discovered instead was a woman building something impossible, one broken piece at a time, with a determination that called to instincts he'd spent decades learning to control. She was going to freeze when winter truly arrived. The shelter she was constructing would collapse under the first heavy snow. Her supplies wouldn't last another month, and the nearest human settlement was 3 days' travel through terrain that had killed experienced mountaineers. By every measure of logic and survival, Rowan Vale should have given up days ago. Instead, she bled on broken wood and sang softly to herself while working, as if building her impossible cabin was the most natural thing in the world. The Lycan king found himself unable to look away. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The wolf had been circling her camp for 3 nights, before Rowan finally acknowledged its presence. She first noticed the tracks on the 4th morning of her construction project. Massive paw prints pressed deep into the mud beside the stream where she collected water. Too large to be a natural wolf, too precise to be anything but deliberate. The prints circled her clearing at a distance that spoke of observation rather than stalking, curiosity rather than hunger. "I know you're there," she said to the tree line as she sorted through her collection of salvaged branches, separating the merely crooked from the completely unusable. "You might as well show yourself instead of lurking like some kind of forest ghost." Silence answered her, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. But Rowan had grown up in rural Oregon, had learned to read the subtle signs of wildlife presence before she'd learned to read books. The wolf was there, just beyond the edge of visibility, watching her work with an intensity that should have been alarming. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. After 2 weeks of complete solitude, even the attention of a potential predator felt like companionship. "Suit yourself," she muttered, returning to her work. "But I'm not sharing my dinner, so don't get any ideas." The morning's task was reinforcing the cabin's eastern wall, which had partially collapsed during the night when one of her support beams had given way under the weight of an inadequate joint. She'd spent an hour before dawn collecting replacement timber, her hands growing numb in the pre-winter cold as she dragged fallen branches back to her clearing. The work was frustrating in ways that went beyond simple physical challenge. Rowan had a master's degree in civil engineering, had spent 5 years designing bridges and skyscrapers for a firm in Portland. She understood load distribution, structural integrity, the mathematics of building things that would stand against time and weather. But understanding theory and implementing it with inferior materials were entirely different challenges. Her carefully calculated joints kept failing because bark rope couldn't provide the tension that steel cables would. Her precisely measured angles meant nothing when the wood itself was warped and splitting. "This would be easier with proper tools," she said to her invisible observer, wrestling a particularly stubborn branch into position. "A few power tools, some actual lumber, maybe some concrete for the foundation. But then again, if I had access to proper tools, I probably wouldn't be building a cabin in the middle of nowhere, would I?" The branch slipped, catching her thumb between 2 pieces of wood and drawing blood that looked shockingly bright against the weathered timber. Rowan cursed creatively, sucking on the injured digit while glaring at her construction project, as if it had personally offended her. That was when she heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps. Multiple sets of them, moving through the forest with purpose and coordination that spoke of military precision. Rowan's blood went cold. She'd chosen this location specifically because it was supposed to be uninhabited, too remote for casual hikers and too difficult to reach for anything but emergency access. The nearest road was 15 miles away through terrain that required serious mountaineering skills to navigate. She grabbed the hunting knife from her belt, a pathetic weapon against multiple attackers, but better than facing whatever was coming empty-handed. The footsteps were growing closer, accompanied now by the sound of voices speaking in low tones, and the occasional crack of breaking branches. "Behind me." The voice came from directly beside her, so close that she could feel warm breath against her ear. Rowan spun around to find herself face to face with the largest man she'd ever seen in her life. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of a dark wool coat, and hands that looked like they could crush stone without effort. His hair was black as midnight, pulled back in a style that revealed sharp cheekbones and a jaw that seemed carved from granite. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, golden amber that seemed to glow with their own light, inhuman in their intensity. "Who are you?" she managed, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Someone who doesn't want you harmed." He moved to position himself between Rowan and the approaching sounds, his presence radiating a kind of controlled violence that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Stay close. Don't run." Before she could ask what he meant, armed men began emerging from the tree line. 6 of them, all carrying military-style weapons and moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers. They wore no uniforms, no identifying marks, but everything about them screamed private military or worse. The leader, a man with pale eyes and a scar running from his temple to his jaw, raised his rifle when he saw Rowan and her unexpected protector. "Well, well, looks like the little bird has found herself a guard dog." "You're trespassing," the dark-haired stranger said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "This territory is protected." "Protected by what army?" the scarred man sneered. "I don't see any backup, friend. Just you and a scared little girl who's been running from her problems for weeks now." Ice flooded Rowan's veins at the implications. These men weren't here by accident. They'd been tracking her, following her trail through the mountains. But why? She'd left Portland quietly, hadn't contacted anyone, had deliberately chosen isolation to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. "What do you want?" she asked, stepping slightly behind her protector despite her instinct to face threats directly. "What we've always wanted, sweetheart. For you to come back and answer some questions about your former employer." The scarred man's smile was cold as winter. "Mr. Henderson has some concerns about what you might know regarding certain irregularities in project specifications." Henderson. The name hit like a physical blow, dragging up memories Rowan had been trying to bury. James Henderson, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, the engineering firm where she'd worked until 6 weeks ago, where she'd discovered that load calculations had been deliberately falsified, that safety margins had been reduced to increase profit margins, that the residential complex they were designing would likely collapse within 5 years of completion, where she'd made the mistake of thinking that reporting the irregularities through proper channels would result in justice rather than retaliation. "I don't know anything," she said, though they all knew it was a lie. Sure you don't. That's why you ran instead of sticking around to discuss things like a reasonable person. The gunman's attention flicked to her protector. And that's why we're going to take you somewhere private, where we can refresh your memory properly. No. The single word from the dark-haired stranger carried such absolute finality that several of the armed men actually took a step backward. She's under my protection. You leave now, or you don't leave at all. The scarred leader laughed, though the sound held no humor. Big talk from one man facing 6. I like your confidence, friend, but the math doesn't work in your favor. What happened next defied everything Rowan thought she understood about human limitations. The stranger moved with speed that seemed impossible, crossing the distance to the nearest gunman before the man could even raise his weapon. There was a brief moment of contact, a sickening crack of breaking bones, and then the gunman was falling backward with his rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. The other 5 opened fire immediately, automatic weapons filling the clearing with thunder and chaos. But the stranger wasn't where their bullets were aimed. He seemed to flow between the gunshots like water, striking with precision that spoke of training far beyond anything military or law enforcement could provide. In less than 30 seconds, 5 of the 6 attackers were down, unconscious or worse. Only the scarred leader remained, and he was backing toward the tree line with his weapon trained on Rowan rather than her protector. Interesting friends you've made, he called out, his earlier confidence replaced by something that might have been fear. Tell me, sweetheart, do you know what your knight in shining armor really is? Before Rowan could ask what he meant, a sound rolled across the clearing that made her bones vibrate with primal terror. It was a howl, but deeper and more powerful than any natural wolf could produce. It was answered immediately by others, dozens of them, rising from the forest around the clearing in a chorus that spoke of pack coordination and overwhelming numbers. The scarred man's face went white. Lycans, he breathed, then louder. You didn't tell us there were Lycans in this territory. Because you didn't ask the right questions, the stranger replied calmly, though I suppose it doesn't matter now. The howling grew closer, and through the trees, Rowan could see shapes moving with purpose and speed. Large shapes, too big to be natural wolves, flowing through the underbrush like liquid shadow. The gunman made a final, desperate choice. Instead of trying to escape, he swung his weapon toward Rowan, finger tightening on the trigger, but he never got the chance to fire. The stranger's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was a man, the next he was something out of nightmare, a massive wolf-like creature that stood upright, with claws like curved blades and teeth designed to tear through anything that stood in his path. The gunman's scream was cut short with brutal efficiency. When the clearing fell silent again, Rowan found herself alone with the creature that had saved her life. It turned toward her slowly, its golden eyes unchanged from the human form it had worn moments before, and she realized with crystal clarity that her understanding of the world had just shattered beyond repair. Lycan, she whispered, the word feeling strange on her tongue. The creature nodded once, then began the transformation back to human form. Bones shifted, fur receded, and within moments, the dark-haired stranger stood before her again, completely naked and apparently unconcerned by the fact. My name is Draven, he said, as if introducing himself after committing multiple homicides was the most natural thing in the world. Draven Ashworm, and you, Rowan Vale, are in significantly more danger than you realized. How do you know my name? She asked, though it seemed like a minor concern given everything she'd just witnessed. I've been watching you for a week, learning about you, trying to understand why a human woman would choose to build a cabin in territory claimed by my pack. His attention flicked to her makeshift construction project. It's an admirable effort, but it won't survive the winter. It's what I have to work with, Rowan said defensively. I'm doing the best I can with broken materials. I know. Something in his voice made her look up sharply, and she was surprised to see what might have been approval in his golden eyes. That's why I'm here. Before she could ask what he meant, other figures began emerging from the forest, men and women who moved with the same predatory grace as Draven, all carrying bundles of what looked like professionally cut lumber. They deposited their loads near Rowan's construction site without a word, then melted back into the trees as silently as they'd appeared. What is this? Rowan asked, staring at the neat stacks of timber, properly measured beams, and construction supplies that represented more resources than she'd seen in months. Help, Draven replied simply. You're building something. I'm ensuring it doesn't collapse. I didn't ask for help. No, but you need it nonetheless. He moved toward one of the timber stacks, running his hand along the smooth surface of a perfectly cut beam. These will provide the structural support your current materials cannot. The joints will hold, the walls will stand, and you'll survive the winter. And what do you want in return? Because in Rowan's experience, help always came with a price. And the more desperately you needed it, the higher that price tended to be. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on something beyond the clearing. When he spoke, his words carried weight she didn't understand. I want to see what you build when you have the proper tools. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Rowan couldn't begin to process. She looked around the clearing, at the dead mercenaries, at the stacks of professional-grade lumber, at the man who claimed to be a Lycan king and had apparently been watching her struggle for days without intervening until she was in mortal danger. This is insane, she said finally. Yes, Draven agreed, but insanity and impossibility often look very similar from the outside. As if to prove his point, he picked up one of the broken branches she'd been trying to use as a support beam and snapped it effortlessly with one hand. Then he selected one of the new timbers, solid oak, that would have taken her hours to cut to length, and positioned it exactly where her inadequate materials had been failing. Show me, he said, stepping back to give her access to the materials. Show me what you can build when the foundation is strong enough to support your vision. Rowan stared at him, at the lumber, at the impossible situation she'd somehow stumbled into. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should run, should put as much distance as possible between herself and a creature that could transform into a killing machine at will. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to attempt an impossible construction project with broken materials, was already calculating load distributions and joint specifications for timber that wouldn't split under pressure. The foundation needs to be deeper if we're using heavier materials, she heard herself say, and the support posts should be buried at least 3 feet to account for frost heave. Draven's smile was sharp and satisfied. Then we dig deeper foundations. As the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where professional lumber lay stacked beside the remains of Rowan's impossible dream, she found herself taking the first steps toward building something that might actually stand against the coming winter. She just wasn't sure whether she was constructing a cabin or walking into a trap that would prove far more dangerous than the men with guns who'd come hunting her. The cabin rose from the clearing like something born of magic and mathematics combined. By the end of the first week working with proper materials, Rowan had a foundation that would have met any building code and walls that stood straight and true against the mountain winds. The timber that Draven's people had provided was better than anything she could have afforded even when she'd had a steady income. Old-growth oak and pine, seasoned perfectly and cut with precision that spoke of master craftsmanship. More mysterious than the materials was the labor force that appeared and disappeared like forest spirits. Each morning when Rowan emerged from her tent, she'd refuse Draven's offer to house her in what he referred to as the main compound, until her cabin was complete. She would find that overnight progress had been made. Complicated joints had been cut and fitted. Heavy beams had been raised into position that should have required multiple people and mechanical assistance. Foundation stones had been laid with the kind of precision that usually required surveying equipment. "How many people are working on this at night?" she asked Draven during one of his daily visits, gesturing toward a section of roof framing that definitely hadn't existed when she'd gone to sleep. "Enough," was his characteristically unhelpful reply. He sat on a stack of lumber watching her work with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. For a creature that could transform into something out of nightmares, he had a remarkably calming presence during his human hours. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." His golden eyes tracked her movements as she checked the alignment of the wall studs, making minute adjustments to ensure everything was perfectly level. "Does it matter how the work gets done, as long as it's done correctly?" Rowan considered the question while running her hand along a joint that had been cut with mechanical precision. In her previous life, she would have demanded to know every detail: who was doing the work, what their qualifications were, whether proper safety procedures were being followed. But her previous life had been built on rules and regulations that clearly didn't apply to whatever reality she'd stumbled into. "I suppose not," she admitted, "though I'd like to thank whoever's been helping. They know you're grateful. That's sufficient." It was a strange way to live, accepting help from invisible benefactors who expected nothing in return. Rowan had grown up in a world where every favor carried an obligation, where kindness was usually a prelude to exploitation. The idea that these Lycans, and she'd accepted that's what they were, despite the impossibility of it, might genuinely want to help her succeed without asking for payment, was almost harder to believe than their ability to transform into wolves. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, settling beside him on the lumber stack. 2 weeks of working together had created an odd sort of companionship between them, though she still knew virtually nothing about his life beyond his name and his apparent authority over the other Lycans. "Building the cabin? Because you asked for proper materials." "No, all of it. Watching me, protecting me from those mercenaries, providing timber and labor." She gestured toward the half-completed structure that was already more solid than anything she could have built alone. "Why invest this much effort in helping a random human woman?" Draven was quiet for so long that Rowan began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured in a way that suggested he was revealing more than he intended. "You remind me of something I thought was lost." "What kind of something?" "Hope, perhaps. Or stubbornness that looks enough like hope to serve the same purpose." He picked up a wood shaving from the ground, turning it over in his hands with unnecessary focus. "Do you know how long I've been watching humans destroy things?" The question seemed rhetorical, but Rowan waited for him to continue. 237 years, he said finally. "Wars, environmental destruction, casual cruelty to anything weaker than themselves. I've watched your kind spread across the landscape like a plague, consuming everything in your path and leaving nothing but waste behind." That's a rather bleak assessment of humanity. It's an accurate assessment based on extensive observation. His attention returned to her, golden eyes searching her face for something she couldn't identify. "But then I found you, building something impossible with broken materials, bleeding on splinters rather than giving up. And for the first time in decades, I wondered if perhaps I'd been watching the wrong humans." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Rowan felt the weight of his attention, the intensity of a gaze that seemed to see more than she was prepared to reveal. "I'm not particularly special," she said quietly. "I'm just too stubborn to quit when I should." "Yes," Draven agreed. "That's exactly what makes you remarkable." Before she could process what he meant by that, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the forest silence. Engines, multiple of them, growing closer through terrain that should have been impassable to anything without four-wheel drive and serious ground clearance. Draven was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from contemplative to predatory. "Inside the cabin," he ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Now." But Rowan had spent too many years being told what to do by men who assumed she couldn't handle difficult situations. "I'm not hiding from whatever this is. Those mercenaries found me once. Running away won't stop them from finding me again. This isn't about the mercenaries." Draven's expression was grim as he scanned the tree line. "This is something else entirely." The vehicles broke through the forest edge moments later. 3 black SUVs with government plates, and the kind of modifications that suggested federal law enforcement or worse. They arranged themselves in a semicircle around the clearing with military precision, blocking every obvious escape route. Armed agents emerged from each vehicle, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. They wore tactical gear and moved with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had done this many times before. At their head was a woman in her 40s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "Draven Ashworm," she called across the clearing, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "By order of the Federal Paranormal Investigation Unit, you are under arrest for violation of the Supernatural Registration Act." "Agent Morrison," Draven replied, his tone polite, but carrying an undercurrent of threat that made the armed agents shift nervously. "I wasn't aware the Registration Act applied to sovereign territories. It applies everywhere within United States borders. You know that." Morrison stepped forward, her weapon still holstered, but her hand resting on the grip. "You've been operating without proper documentation for months. The patience of my superiors has finally run out." Rowan felt the world tilting around her as the implications sank in. Federal agents investigating supernatural activities. Registration acts for Lycans. The casual discussion of jurisdictional authority between a government official and a man who could transform into a wolf suggested a reality far more complex than she'd imagined. "How long?" she asked quietly. How long what? Morrison's attention flicked to her with the kind of sharp focus that suggested she was cataloging every detail for future reference. How long have you known? About Lycans. About supernatural communities. About the fact that the world isn't what most people think it is. Officially? About 15 years, since the Yellowstone incident forced disclosure within certain federal agencies. Morrison's smile was thin. Unofficially? Much longer than that. And now you're here to arrest him for what? Existing without a permit? For operating a pack without federal oversight? For maintaining territory without proper registration? And for interfering with federal investigations? Morrison's gaze hardened. Also for the murder of 6 federal contractors whose bodies were found in this clearing 2 weeks ago. The mercenaries. Of course, the government would eventually investigate their disappearance, would trace their last known location back to her clearing. What Rowan hadn't expected was that their deaths would provide pretext for arresting Draven rather than protecting him. Those men were trying to kidnap me, she said, stepping forward despite Draven's warning growl. He saved my life. According to whose testimony? Yours? Morrison's laugh held no humor. You're a fugitive yourself, Ms. Vale. Wanted for questioning in connection with the Henderson construction scandal. Your credibility isn't exactly unimpeachable. I reported safety violations. That's not a crime. Theft of proprietary information is. Industrial espionage is. Terrorism charges related to infrastructure sabotage certainly are. Morrison gestured to her agents, who began moving into flanking positions. You've caused a lot of powerful people a lot of problems. They want those problems resolved. Rowan felt ice forming in her veins as the scope of her situation became clear. The mercenaries hadn't been working independently. They'd been federal contractors, which meant the government itself was involved in covering up the safety violations she'd discovered. Her exile to the mountains hadn't been escape. It had been a temporary delay before more official retaliation arrived. You're corrupt, she said, though the words felt inadequate to describe the enormity of what was being revealed. I'm practical, Morrison corrected. The Henderson project represents billions in infrastructure investment. A few engineering shortcuts aren't worth derailing economic development that will benefit thousands of people. Those shortcuts will kill people when the buildings collapse. That's a risk assessment for others to make. My job is to ensure that federal resources aren't wasted investigating allegations that can't be proven in court. Around them, the armed agents were taking positions that spoke of imminent action. Rowan found herself caught between the federal agents who wanted to arrest her and the Lycan king who had somehow become her protector. Neither option offered much hope for long-term survival. That was when she heard it. A sound like wind through trees, but rhythmic, purposeful. Footsteps, hundreds of them, moving through the forest with the same coordination she'd witnessed from Draven's people 2 weeks earlier. Morrison heard it too, her expression shifting from confident authority to something approaching concern. How many? She called to Draven. Enough, he replied, using the same non-answer he'd given Rowan about the overnight construction work. The sound grew closer, and through the trees, shapes began to emerge. Not the handful of Lycans who had been helping with the cabin construction, but dozens of them. Men and women who moved with predatory grace, surrounding the clearing with the patient inevitability of a closing trap. This is a federal operation, Morrison called out, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Interfering with federal agents is a felony. Kidnapping members of my pack is an act of war, Draven replied calmly. Choose your next actions carefully, Agent Morrison. The standoff stretched taut. Federal weapons aimed at Lycan shapes that seemed to multiply in the shadows between trees. Rowan found herself at the center of forces she couldn't control, caught between government corruption and supernatural politics that operated by rules she didn't understand. This doesn't have to escalate, she said, stepping into the space between the two sides. I'll come with you voluntarily if you leave Draven and his people alone. No. The word came from Draven with such finality that several federal agents actually flinched. You're under my protection. That doesn't end because federal agents make threats. Your protection doesn't extend to interfering with federal investigations, Morrison snapped. Stand down or face the consequences. What consequences? Draven asked, and there was something in his voice that made the temperature in the clearing seem to drop several degrees. Arrest? Imprisonment? You can't hold what you can't catch, Agent Morrison. And you can't catch something that doesn't recognize your authority. What happened next defied everything Rowan thought she understood about the relationship between federal law enforcement and supernatural communities. The Lycans didn't attack, didn't transform into weapons of violence. Instead, they simply disappeared. One moment there were dozens of figures visible in the tree line. The next, the forest was empty except for shadows and silence. Even Draven seemed to fade from view, becoming indistinct in a way that hurt to look at directly. The federal agents spun in circles, weapons aimed at threats that were no longer there to target. Morrison spoke rapidly into her radio, calling for backup, for air support, for anything that might help them maintain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond their grasp. "Where did they go?" one of the agents called out. "They're still here," Morrison replied grimly. "Somewhere. Lycans don't just vanish." But apparently they could, because despite the agents' increasingly frantic search of the clearing and surrounding forest, no trace of Draven or his pack could be found. It was as if they had melted into the landscape itself, becoming part of the mountain wilderness that had hidden them for centuries. Rowan stood alone in the center of the clearing, watching federal agents discover the limitations of human authority when confronted with creatures that operated by different rules entirely. Her half-completed cabin looked absurdly normal amid the chaos, its straight walls and proper joints, a testament to the collaboration that had apparently just evaporated. "Ms. Vale," Morrison called, her weapon now pointed directly at Rowan. "You're coming with us, voluntarily or otherwise." But before anyone could move, Draven's voice echoed from the forest around them, seeming to come from every direction at once. "Touch her and die." The words carried such absolute promise of violence that Morrison actually took a step backward. The federal agents began retreating toward their vehicles, the confident authority they'd arrived with, replaced by the nervous energy of predators who had suddenly realized they were the ones being hunted. "This isn't over," Morrison called toward the trees. "We know where you are now. We'll be back with sufficient force to end this." "You're welcome to try," came the response, though Rowan couldn't pinpoint its source. "But remember, Agent Morrison, you're not hunting criminals hiding in caves. You're facing a people who have survived in these mountains since before your government existed. Consider whether escalation serves your interests." The federal agents withdrew with as much dignity as they could manage, their vehicles disappearing back into the forest as quickly as they'd arrived. But their threat lingered in the air like smoke, the promise of future confrontation that would inevitably involve greater violence. Gradually, the Lycans began to reappear, first as movement in peripheral vision, then as distinct figures stepping out from behind trees that should have been too small to provide concealment. Draven materialized last, emerging from a patch of afternoon shadow, as if he'd been part of it all along. "How did you do that?" Rowan asked, still trying to process what she'd witnessed. "Ancient skills, older than governments, older than the need to hide from human authority." He moved to examine the clearing where the federal vehicles had been parked, studying tire tracks and footprints with the intensity of someone reading a story in the disturbed earth. "They'll be back within days, possibly hours, and next time they'll bring sufficient force to overwhelm defensive measures. So what do we do?" "We finish the cabin," Draven said simply. "Tonight." "Tonight? It's only half complete. The roof isn't even. We'll be finished by dawn." His golden eyes met hers with absolute certainty. "My people work faster when motivated by necessity." As if summoned by his words, Lycans began emerging from the forest carrying materials Rowan hadn't seen before. Prefabricated roof sections that would fit the cabin's dimensions perfectly, windows and doors that looked custom-made, furnishings and supplies that would transform the bare structure into something resembling an actual home. "You had this planned all along," she realized. "The whole time I thought you were helping me build something, you were preparing for this moment." "I was preparing for multiple possibilities," Draven corrected, "one of which was that your past would catch up with you before the cabin was completed. And the others?" He was quiet for a moment, watching his people work with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had practiced this exact scenario. When he spoke, his words carried weight that seemed to settle in her chest like stones. "That you would choose to stay once you understood what staying meant. That you would accept protection that comes with obligations you're not yet ready to understand. That you would trust me enough to let me keep you safe." The implications of his words hit her like cold water. This wasn't just about completing construction or evading federal agents. This was about choosing between the life she'd been running from and a future she couldn't yet comprehend. "What kind of obligations?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. The kind that bind you to this place, to these people, to me. Draven's attention remained fixed on the construction work, but she could feel the intensity of his focus on her response. The kind that make running away impossible, even if staying proves more dangerous than anything you've left behind. Rowan watched Lycan's work with supernatural speed and precision, transforming her simple cabin into something that looked like it could weather any storm. In a few hours, she would have the home she'd been building with broken materials for weeks. All she had to do was accept that it came with ties to a world she didn't understand, protection from a man who could transform into a creature of legend, and obligations that apparently couldn't be explained until she'd already committed to fulfilling them. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then I ensure you reach safety beyond federal jurisdiction, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have built if you'd chosen to stay. And if I say yes?" Draven finally turned to face her directly, his golden eyes holding depths she was only beginning to recognize. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy and promise combined. "Then you discover what you're truly capable of building when you have not just proper materials, but people willing to stand beside you while you build it." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, and Lycan efficiency transformed her clearing into something that looked like the opening scene of a fairy tale, Rowan found herself facing a choice that would determine not just where she slept that night, but who she became in all the nights that followed. The cabin was nearly complete, its walls straight and strong, its foundation deep enough to weather any storm. All that remained was for her to decide whether she was brave enough to live in something built to last. The cabin stood complete in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows glowing with warm light that transformed the clearing into something from a dream. Rowan moved through rooms that felt impossibly spacious after weeks of sleeping in a tent, running her hands along walls that had been fitted with a precision no human crew could have achieved in such a short time. Everything was perfect. The kitchen had been equipped with appliances that somehow ran on generators hidden so well she couldn't hear them. The living room featured a stone fireplace that drew perfectly, and furniture that looked handcrafted, but comfortable. Even the bedroom had been furnished with linens that felt like silk, and a bed frame carved from what appeared to be a single piece of timber. It was beautiful, functional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "They did all this in one night," she said to Draven, who stood by the main window watching the forest with the alert stillness of a predator anticipating danger. "They did what was necessary." His attention remained fixed on the tree line, though she could tell he was aware of her every movement through the space they had created. "The question now is whether you'll allow yourself to live in it." Rowan understood what he meant. The cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a commitment, a statement that she intended to stay, to become part of whatever community had invested such effort in ensuring her survival. Accepting it meant accepting obligations she still didn't fully understand. "Tell me about the pack," she said, settling into a chair positioned to give her a clear view of both Draven and the forest beyond. "How many people are we talking about? What kind of society? What would I be agreeing to become part of?" 43 adults, 16 children. Draven's response came without hesitation, as if he'd been expecting the question. "We maintain 3 settlements in these mountains, connected by trails that exist on no government maps. Most pack members were born here, though some joined us after leaving human society for various reasons. Reasons like mine? Some. Others came because they were already Lycans who chose pack life over isolation. A few married into the community and chose to stay." His golden eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to their surveillance. Each brought something useful: skills, knowledge, perspectives that strengthened the whole. "And what would I bring? Besides the ability to spot structural engineering problems? You already know the answer to that." Draven moved away from the window, settling across from her with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "You refuse to quit when quitting would be reasonable. You build things that shouldn't be possible with materials that shouldn't work. You stand up to authority when authority is wrong. Those sound more like character flaws than useful skills. They're leadership qualities. Rare ones." His expression grew serious. "The pack has been stable for decades, but stability isn't the same as growth. We need someone who can envision changes that improve our lives without compromising our security." The weight of what he was suggesting settled over Rowan like a heavy blanket. "You're not just asking me to join your community, you're asking me to help lead it. I'm asking you to become what you were always meant to be, in a place where that's possible, rather than dangerous." Before she could respond to that loaded statement, A sound from outside drew both their attention. Not the coordinated movement of pack members, but something more chaotic. Vehicles moving fast through terrain that would challenge even experienced off-road drivers. "How many?" Rowan asked, though she suspected she already knew. More than last time. Drevin was already moving toward the door, his entire demeanor shifting into something that radiated controlled violence. Morrison brought reinforcements. Through the window, Rowan could see lights flickering between the trees. Not the steady beams of normal headlights, but the harsh white glare of military-grade illumination. As the vehicles broke through the forest edge, she counted at least a dozen trucks and armored cars, along with what appeared to be a mobile command center. Federal agents poured from the vehicles with military precision, but these weren't the same agents from the previous encounter. These wore heavier armor, carried automatic weapons, and moved with the coordination of soldiers rather than investigators. Whatever authority Morrison had called upon, it was prepared for serious resistance. "Draven Ashworm," Morrison's voice carried across the clearing through electronic amplification. "By order of federal emergency protocols, this area is now under martial law. Surrender yourself and Ms. Vale immediately, or face the consequences of armed resistance." "Martial law?" Rowan stared at the federal force surrounding her new home. "They can do that? They can declare it. Whether they can enforce it is another question entirely." Draven's expression was grim as he assessed the tactical situation. "But they've brought sufficient force to make the attempt costly for everyone involved." Through the cabin's windows, Rowan could see federal agents setting up what looked like serious military equipment. Spotlights that turned the clearing into something resembling a movie set. Communications arrays that suggested coordination with off-site commanders. Weapons that looked designed for warfare rather than law enforcement. "This isn't about arresting us anymore," she realized. "This is about making an example." Yes. Morrison's superiors have decided that tolerance of supernatural independence sets a dangerous precedent. Draven moved through the cabin with purposeful efficiency, checking windows and exits with the eye of someone planning defensive strategies. They want to demonstrate that federal authority extends everywhere within American borders. And if we resist, then people die. Possibly many people. His golden eyes met hers directly. "The question is whether you're willing to let that happen to protect your freedom, or whether you'd prefer to surrender and hope federal custody is survivable." The choice he was presenting felt impossibly heavy. Surrender and face whatever retaliation Henderson's people had arranged through federal channels. Resist and trigger violence that could cost lives among people who had done nothing but help her build a home. But as she looked around the cabin, at walls that stood straight and true, at furniture crafted with impossible skill, at windows that framed the wilderness she'd begun to think of as home, Rowan realized that surrender would be its own form of violence, not just to herself, but to everyone who had invested effort in proving that alternatives to federal authority were possible. "There's a third option," she said slowly, "which is, we give them what they actually want." Rowan moved to the window, studying the federal deployment with the eye of someone who had spent years analyzing structural problems. "They're not really here for us. They're here to demonstrate that they can project power into territory they don't actually control." "I'm not following." Morrison said the pack has been operating without proper registration, without federal oversight. "What if we change that?" Draven's expression darkened. "Registration means government control. Oversight means federal agents monitoring every aspect of pack life. You're suggesting we surrender our independence voluntarily. I'm suggesting we negotiate from a position where we have something they want, more than they want to destroy us." Rowan turned to face him directly. "You said the pack needs someone who can envision changes without compromising security. This is that kind of change." Before he could respond, Morrison's amplified voice cut through the night again. "You have 30 minutes to surrender voluntarily. After that, we proceed with tactical extraction." Tactical extraction. The euphemism for military assault was both chilling and clarifying. Whatever Morrison's orders were, they included authorization for lethal force against American citizens whose only crime was living outside federal jurisdiction. "Let me talk to her," Rowan said. "Absolutely not." Draven's response was immediate and final. "You don't negotiate with people who've already decided violence is acceptable. You don't negotiate with them from a position of weakness. But if we approach this correctly, we might not be in a position of weakness." She moved toward the cabin's main door, but Draven intercepted her before she could reach it. His hand on her arm was gentle, but implacable. and his golden eyes blazed with something that looked like fear. "I've spent decades keeping this pack safe from federal interference. I won't risk that by letting you walk into their hands. And I won't let people die because I was too afraid to try diplomacy before resorting to violence." Rowan met his gaze directly, seeing her own determination reflected in his inhuman features. "Trust me, please." The word hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Trust meant more than believing she could handle a dangerous negotiation. It meant accepting that she had the right to make decisions that affected pack safety, that her judgment was worth risking everything he'd built. "If this goes wrong," he began, "then we face the consequences together." She placed her hand over his, feeling the barely controlled strength in his grip. "But if it goes right, we might find a path that doesn't require choosing between freedom and survival." After a moment that felt like eternity, Draven stepped aside. "I'll be listening to every word. And if Morrison or her people make any move that threatens you, diplomatic immunity won't protect them from the consequences." Rowan nodded, understanding that she was walking into a situation where her words would determine whether people lived or died. But as she opened the cabin door and stepped into the harsh glare of federal spotlights, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was what she did. She identified structural problems and engineered solutions. The fact that the structure in question was political, rather than architectural, didn't change the fundamental approach. "Agent Morrison," she called across the clearing, keeping her hands visible and her voice steady. "I'd like to discuss terms for a peaceful resolution." "The terms are simple," Morrison replied through her amplifier. "Surrender now or face extraction. I'm offering something better, a solution that gives you what you actually need without requiring violence that will generate political complications for your superiors." There was a pause, during which Rowan could see Morrison speaking rapidly into her radio. When she responded, her electronic amplification was turned off, requiring her to raise her voice to carry across the distance. "What kind of solution? The kind that turns an embarrassing federal overreach into a successful negotiation with a previously unknown Native American community." Rowan stepped forward slowly, telegraph her non-threatening intent. "May I approach? This conversation requires nuance that shouting doesn't provide." After another consultation with her radio, Morrison gestured for Rowan to advance. Federal agents tracked her movement with their weapons, but no one interfered as she crossed the clearing to within normal speaking distance of the mobile command center. "Native American community?" Morrison asked, her expression skeptical but interested. "Unregistered tribal settlement with historical land claims predating federal territorial organization," Rowan explained. "Discovered during investigation of illegal construction in protected forest. Resolution achieved through diplomatic negotiation rather than enforcement action." She could see Morrison processing the implications, how such a narrative would play with congressional oversight committees, with media coverage, with the political appointees who had authorized this operation. A successful negotiation would reflect much better on careers than would a military assault on American citizens. "And the lycanthropy?" Morrison asked quietly. "Genetic condition affecting isolated population. Managed through traditional medical practices that prove compatible with federal health and safety standards." Rowan met Morrison's gaze directly. "Nothing that requires special legislation or extraordinary measures. You're suggesting we pretend this never happened. I'm suggesting we reframe what happened in terms that benefit everyone involved. Your superiors get to claim successful resolution of a complex territorial dispute. My community gets recognition and protection under existing Native American legal frameworks. Everyone wins without anyone dying." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, speaking in low tones with other federal officials who had emerged from the command vehicle. When she returned her attention to Rowan, her expression was calculating rather than hostile. "What about Henderson's concerns? The industrial espionage charges? Resolved through whistleblower protection statutes, once the tribal community agrees to provide testimony regarding environmental damage to traditionally held lands." Rowan had spent her approach working through the legal angles, identifying frameworks that already existed to support the narrative she was constructing. Federal environmental protection of tribal lands takes precedence over corporate interests. "That's actually elegant." Morrison's admission came with obvious reluctance. "But it would require your community to accept federal oversight, regular inspections, compliance with tribal governance regulations, which we're prepared to negotiate, assuming the terms are reasonable and respect traditional autonomy. Rowan glanced back toward the cabin, where she could see Draven's silhouette in the window. We're not opposed to working within existing legal frameworks. We just refuse to be criminalized for existing. The negotiation that followed took most of the remaining night. Federal officials who had arrived prepared for military action found themselves instead drafting memoranda of understanding, territorial recognition documents, and provisional agreements that would require months of bureaucratic follow-up to formalize. By dawn, Agent Morrison was shaking Rowan's hand and expressing cautious optimism about the precedent they were setting for future supernatural federal relations. The tactical teams were packing their assault equipment back into vehicles that would leave the clearing empty except for tire tracks and a few trampled areas. "This won't be the last time you hear from federal authorities," Morrison warned as she prepared to depart. "Recognition comes with responsibilities, and there will be oversight." "Understood," Rowan replied. "But oversight is very different from occupation." "Yes, it is." Morrison paused at her vehicle door, studying Rowan with something that might have been respect. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Violence would have served no one's interests." As the federal convoy disappeared back into the forest, Rowan found herself alone in the clearing, with a cabin that had survived its first political crisis, and a community that had avoided war through negotiation rather than force. Draven emerged from the cabin as the last federal vehicle vanished from sight, his expression unreadable as he approached her. "Native American tribal community?" he asked. "It's not entirely inaccurate. Your people have been living on this land longer than the federal government has existed. You maintain traditional governance structures, and you have legitimate claims to territorial autonomy." Rowan managed a tired smile. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that acknowledge truths everyone was already pretending to ignore. "And the federal oversight will be manageable if we're proactive about compliance and transparent about our practices. They want to ensure we're not a threat to national security. We can prove we're not without surrendering our independence." Draven was quiet for a long moment, studying the cabin that stood intact, despite everything that had threatened it. When he spoke, his words carried weight that settled into her bones like a promise. "You realize what you've done, don't you? You've not just saved the pack from federal interference. You've given us legal standing we've never had, protection under law instead of hiding from it. I've bought us time and recognition. What we do with those advantages is up to all of us." Rowan looked around the clearing that had become home in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Assuming, of course, that I'm actually part of the us I keep referring to." "Are you?" The question came softly, but loaded with implications that went far beyond political alliances or community membership. "Are you ready to stay? To build something lasting? To accept obligations that bind you to this place and these people?" Rowan thought about the cabin behind them, constructed with proper materials and impossible speed through cooperation that transcended normal human limitations. She thought about the community she'd glimpsed through their actions, people who worked together without need for contracts or oversight, who protected each other without question, who had invested effort in her success because that's what communities did. She thought about the man beside her, who had watched her struggle for days before revealing himself, who had provided materials without asking for payment, who had trusted her judgment in a crisis that could have destroyed everything he'd spent decades building. "I've been building something my entire life," she said finally. "I just never had the right materials or the right foundation to make it last. Here, with these people, with you." She paused, feeling the weight of decision settle around her like a mantle. "Yes, I'm ready to stay." Draven's smile was slow and transformative, revealing depths of relief and joy that spoke of hopes he hadn't dared to acknowledge even to himself. "Then welcome home, Rowan Vale. Welcome to the beginning of everything you were always meant to build." As the sun rose over the mountain peaks, painting the cabin and clearing in shades of gold and promise, Rowan felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before. Not just safety or shelter, but belonging. The certainty that she had found her place in the world, among people who valued her strengths and accepted her flaws, in a community built on foundations strong enough to weather any storm. The cabin stood complete around them, its walls straight and true, its foundation deep enough to last generations. But the real construction project was just beginning, the building of a life that could encompass both human ambition and supernatural community, individual identity and pack loyalty, the person she had been and the person she was becoming. It would be challenging work, requiring materials she didn't yet understand and techniques she was only beginning to learn. But for the first time in her life, Rowan had proper tools, skilled helpers, and a foundation strong enough to support whatever vision she dared to build upon it. Some things, she realized, were worth building slowly, piece by piece, until they became unshakable. Love was one of those things. Community was another. And sometimes, if you were extraordinarily lucky, you found yourself with the materials to build both at the same time, in a clearing where broken branches had been transformed into something magnificent through the simple refusal to give up. The cabin stood ready. The community stood waiting. And Rowan Vale, former fugitive and current pack member, stood on the threshold of a future she had never dared to imagine, but was finally brave enough to build. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.